always thought I knew everything about my stepson, Jake. We weren't best friends, but we got along well enough. I married his mother when he was 16, and now, at 18, he was growing into his own person. Independent, smart, and sometimes distant. I figured that was just normal for a kid his age. But then, something changed. It started with little things. He became secretive, locking his bedroom door when he never used to. He'd get phone calls late at night and leave the house without saying where he was going. At first, I brushed it off. Teenagers have their own lives, and I didn't want to be the overbearing stepdad. But then, his behavior became impossible to ignore. One evening, I found him sitting alone in the dark living room, his head in his hands. He didn't even notice me at first. When I asked if he was okay, he quickly wiped his face and forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired," he said. But I wasn't convinced. Something was wrong. And the more I paid attention, the more I realized. Jake was carrying a burden, one he wasn't ready to share. Then I saw it. A small, worn-out notebook peeking out from his backpack. It was half open, pages filled with handwriting. I knew I shouldn't invade his privacy, but my gut told me this wasn't just some school journal. Something told me that whatever was inside held the answers to all my questions. That night, while Jake was in the shower, the notebook sat on the kitchen counter. My hands trembled as I picked it up. I told myself I wouldn't read it. I would just take a quick look. But the moment I saw the first few words, my heart nearly stopped. I never expected this. The words on the page blurred as my mind raced. My hands shook slightly, and I felt a wave of guilt for reading something that wasn't meant for me. But at the same time, I couldn't stop. Jake's handwriting was messy, rushed, like he had poured his thoughts onto the page without stopping. The first few lines didn't make much sense. Random phrases, crossed out words. But then I saw it. A sentence that made my stomach drop. "I can't keep this a secret much longer. It's eating me alive." I swallowed hard. What secret? My mind instantly filled with worst-case scenarios. Was he in trouble? Was he hiding something dangerous? I kept reading, my heart pounding louder with each line. I wish I could tell someone, but I don't know how. What if they see me differently? What if they hate me for it? Hate him? I gripped the notebook tighter. Whatever this was, Jake was scared. He was carrying something heavy, and he believed no one would understand. I had no idea what it could be, but I knew one thing. I had to be there for him. Just as I was about to turn another page, I heard the water shut off in the bathroom. My breath caught in my throat. I quickly put the notebook back exactly where I found it and stepped away, trying to act normal. A few seconds later, Jake walked into the kitchen, running a towel through his damp hair. His eyes flicked to his backpack for a split second before he looked at me. "Hey," he said casually, but there was something in his voice, something guarded. "Hey," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. "You good?" He gave a half-hearted nod. "Yeah, just tired. Long day." I wanted to press him for more, to tell him I knew something was wrong, but I also knew that if I pushed too hard, he'd shut down completely. So I let it go, for now. But my mind wouldn't rest. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, 100 thoughts ran through my head. What was Jake hiding? Why was he so afraid to talk about it? And most of all, would he ever trust me enough to tell me the truth? I had to find out. But I had no idea that the truth was going to change everything. The next few days felt different. I watched Jake more closely, noticing the small things I had ignored before. The way his hands fidgeted when he thought no one was looking. The way he hesitated before answering simple questions, like his mind was somewhere else. The way he'd disappear into his room for hours, only coming out when he absolutely had to. I wanted to believe it was normal teenage behavior, that he was just dealing with the stress of growing up. But deep down, I knew better. Something was wrong. One evening, I was sitting in the living room when I heard the front door quietly open. I glanced at the clock, almost midnight. I got up and peeked through the window, just in time to see Jake walking down the street. Hood pulled over his head. My stomach tightened. Where was he going at this hour? Without thinking, I grabbed my jacket and followed him. I kept my distance, careful not to let him see me. He walked with purpose, his pace quick, like he was afraid of being late for something. The further we went, the more uneasy I felt. He wasn't heading to a friend's house. He wasn't stopping at a store. He was heading toward the outskirts of town, where the street lights barely reached. Then he turned down an alley. My heart pounded. What was he doing here? I pressed myself against the wall, watching as he stopped near a dimly lit doorway. A figure stepped out of the shadows. A man, older, maybe in his late 30s. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but Jake's body language told me everything. His shoulders were tense, his hands clenched into fists. Then the man handed Jake something small. My breath caught. Money? A note? Something worse? Jake hesitated before taking it, then shoved it into his pocket. The man said something else, and Jake nodded quickly before turning away, walking back toward home. I stepped back, heart racing. I had so many questions, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just teenage mood swings. Jake was involved in something serious, and whatever it was, he was keeping it hidden from everyone. As he walked past me, unaware that I had been watching, I made a decision. I couldn't ignore this anymore. I had to get to the bottom of it, no matter what it took. The next morning, I could barely focus on anything else. My mind kept replaying what I had seen the night before. Jake meeting that man, taking whatever he had given him, and walking away like it was just another part of his routine. I needed to talk to him, but I had no idea how. If I confronted him too harshly, he might shut me out completely. If I ignored it, I'd be letting him deal with something alone, something that clearly wasn't good. At breakfast, Jake was quiet. He barely touched his food, his eyes glued to his phone. Every few seconds, he'd glance up, almost like he was checking to see if I was watching him. I tried to act normal, but I could feel the tension between us. "You got plans today?" I asked casually. He shrugged. "Just school. Might go out later." "With friends?" His fork froze halfway to his mouth. "Yeah," he said, but his voice was flat. A lie. I could hear it. I nodded, pretending to accept his answer, but inside I was struggling to stay calm. He was hiding something, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I actually knew about what was going on in his life. Who was that man? What had he given him? Was Jake in some kind of trouble? Later that evening, I made a decision. I was going to follow him again. I didn't care if it was crossing a line. I needed to know the truth. When Jake left the house after dinner, I waited a few minutes before slipping out behind him. This time, he was more careful, checking over his shoulder a few times. I had to hang back farther, keeping to the shadows. My heart pounded as he walked toward the same alley as the night before. But something was different this time. The man from before wasn't alone. There were two others with him, and they didn't look friendly. I could see it in their body language, tense, aggressive. Jake stopped a few feet away, hesitation in his step. One of the men stepped forward, speaking in a low voice. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I saw the moment Jake's posture changed. His hands balled into fists, his breathing quickened. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just a simple exchange. Then, without warning, the man grabbed Jake by the arm. And I knew I couldn't just stand there and watch. I didn't think. I just moved. Before I could even process what I was doing, I stepped out of the shadows. My heart was hammering, but I forced myself to stay calm. If I rushed in recklessly, I could make things worse for Jake. Hey, I called out, my voice sharp, commanding. The men turned toward me, surprised. Jake's eyes widened, panic flashing across his face. The guy gripping his arm didn't let go, but his grip loosened just enough for Jake to yank himself free. Who the hell are you? One of the men demanded, stepping forward. He was taller than me, built like he had been in plenty of fights before. I kept my stance firm. His stepdad, I said, my voice steady, and I suggest you back off. The man let out a short laugh, shaking his head. This isn't your business. I glanced at Jake, whose breathing was fast and uneven. His hands were still clenched, his body tense like he was ready to fight or run. I had never seen him like this before, and it terrified me. Let's go, Jake, I said, keeping my focus on him. We're leaving. But Jake didn't move. His eyes darted between the men and me, hesitation written all over his face. He wasn't just scared, he was conflicted. And that's when it hit me. Whatever this was, it wasn't something that had just happened. He wasn't being dragged into trouble against his will. He was already in it. And now I had walked straight into the middle of it without even understanding what I was up against. One of the men, the one who had grabbed Jake, took a step closer, lowering his voice. You don't know what's going on here, do you? I didn't answer, but my silence was enough of an admission. He smirked, glancing at Jake. You didn't tell him, did you? Jake flinched like the words physically hurt. I turned to him, my voice softer now. Jake, what's going on? For a second, I thought he might finally tell me. His eyes were full of something I couldn't quite place. Regret, fear, maybe both. But before he could say a word, the man spoke again. He made a deal, he said, watching me carefully. And we don't take broken promises lightly. A chill ran through me. A deal? What kind of deal? My mind raced, trying to piece it together. Money? A favor? Something worse? Jake exhaled sharply, looking away. I'll handle it, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. But I wasn't about to let that happen. Not alone, I said firmly. Whatever this is, you're not handling it alone. The men exchanged glances. One of them pulled something from his pocket, a folded piece of paper, and held it out to me. I hesitated before taking it, unfolding it with careful hands. As soon as I saw what was inside, my breath caught. This was bigger than I ever could have imagined. I unfolded the paper with shaking hands, my eyes scanning the words written in bold, sharp letters. It wasn't just some deal. It was a contract, a promise Jake had made, something he had agreed to, and now these men were here to collect. Jake looked away, his jaw clenched. I was trying to fix it, he muttered. Fix what? I asked, my voice tense. One of the men smirked. Your boy here took out a favor he couldn't repay. We gave him time, and now the clock's run out. My stomach tightened. What kind of favor? Jake exhaled sharply, finally meeting my eyes. Money, he admitted. I borrowed money. The weight of his words crashed over me. He had been desperate enough to turn to these people, and now they wanted their payment. My mind raced, trying to piece together why. What had he needed the money for? Why didn't he come to us? The man crossed his arms. We don't work on credit, old man. Either he pays or what? I snapped, stepping forward. My pulse was racing, but I wouldn't back down. You think threatening an 18-year-old makes you tough? Jake grabbed my arm. Stop, he said quickly. I don't want this to get worse. I looked at him, my anger shifting into something deeper. This wasn't just about money. This was about whatever had led him here in the first place. The fear in his eyes told me this ran far deeper than I had realized. I turned back to the men. How much? The leader tilted his head, like he hadn't expected me to ask. 3 grand. I clenched my jaw. That wasn't pocket change, but it also wasn't an impossible amount. If it meant getting Jake away from these people, I'd find a way. Fine, I said. Give me 2 days. The man studied me for a moment before nodding. 2 days, he repeated. No more. They turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. Jake looked at me, guilt written all over his face. I didn't want you to get involved. I placed a hand on his shoulder. You're my family. You don't have to do this alone. He hesitated, then finally nodded. But as we walked home, one thought lingered in my mind. Jake wasn't telling me everything, and I had a feeling the real truth was something I wasn't ready for.